Welcome to the MCAT Basics Podcast, brought to you by the physicians at Med School Coach. Each week, Sam Smith breaks down high-yield MCAT topics so you can score as high as possible on test day.
Welcome to MCAT Basics. I'm Sam Smith, and this episode covers the respiratory system. I'm first going to get into a little bit of anatomy related to the respiratory system. Then I'll talk about the several different functions that the respiratory system serves. Number 1, that's gas exchange. I'll talk about number 2, thermoregulation. 3, particle filtration. And 4th, I'll talk briefly about pH control. And then the very last thing I'll talk about in this podcast is how the respiratory system is controlled. Now, this material is going to show up on 2 of the MCAT sections. You get a little 2-for-1 action here. The first section is bio-biochem, and the second is chem phys. And you might be asking, wait, chem phys, where does that come up in the respiratory system? Well, as you'll see, I get into a little bit of physics and chemistry here as I talk about gas exchange and the movement of gases through the lungs. So with all that said, I hope this helps in your studies, and good luck to those of you who are taking the test soon. Okay, so the very first thing I want to get into here is just some general anatomy related to the respiratory system. And as with all anatomy on the MCAT, I always, start out by saying this, is that there's no actual anatomy that you're going to be tested on the MCAT. So you don't got to worry about, recalling these different structures, maybe in recalling their location within the respiratory tract. Rather, this is just kind of a primer to help you understand some of the physiology. So just keep that in mind. Keep that disclaimer in mind as I talk about these things. You don't need to have all this stuff memorized. So the respiratory system can be divided into 2 portions, the lower respiratory tract and the upper respiratory tract. I'm going to talk about each of these individually. I'll start with the upper respiratory tract. So the upper respiratory tract includes several different structures: the nose, the nasal cavity, the sinus, the larynx, and the trachea. The nose and nasal cavity you should be familiar with. That is just, the thing that sits on your face and the cavity behind it. Your sinuses are a connected system of hollow cavities within the skull. They're basically pockets of air on each side of your nose and on your forehead. So if you were to take your hands and kind of put them on each side of your nose, that's essentially where your sinuses are. And then you have them kind of on each side of your forehead. And again, they're these pockets kind of air. But, they're not just pockets of air. They produce mucus, which is a little bit gross to think about. But, think about your nose running. Well, that snot or that mucus that runs out of your nose is actually produced in your sinuses. So it's one of the functions of your sinuses. Again, those are just kind of cavities essentially in your face. The larynx, aka your voice box, is an organ that sits at the top of the neck and is involved in breathing, producing sound, and protecting the trachea from food. Essentially, the larynx has basically a lid on it to prevent food from flowing into the windpipe, into the trachea, and, going down into the lungs, which would be bad. A piece of food getting trapped in the lungs would make you probably, first of all, cough up a lung. Second of all, it would probably do damage to your lungs. And so, again, the larynx protects the trachea and some of the lower respiratory tract from food flowing into them, as well as it's involved in producing speech. You can hear me right now because of my larynx. The last structure here, of course, is the trachea. And anytime someone says, I had water or food go down the wrong pipe, they're talking about the trachea. The trachea, by the way, is also called the windpipe. And this is the tube that goes from the larynx into the lungs. And one function that it has that you may not think about is that it helps wet the air that travels from outside your body into the lungs. It provides moisture to that air. And by the way, this is that hard, lumpy part of your throat that you can, reach over and actually feel on your throat. I'm doing it right now, and I probably sound weird, but that is the trachea. Now, anatomically speaking, the esophagus, which is the tube that food travels through down to the stomach, sits literally right behind the trachea. They run completely parallel to each other, but of course they have different things that flow through them. As I said, down the esophagus is where food goes, and then air goes down the trachea, and the trachea is kind of in front of the esophagus. So that is the upper respiratory tract. Now let me get to the lower respiratory tract. So the lower respiratory tract is kind of broken down into two different parts. I'll first talk about the lungs here. That's the first part. And then the alveoli is the second part that I want to talk about. These are the really small kind of functional units of the lungs. All right. So the lungs are the organs that fill up with air. I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with what these are. And these are the main organ of the respiratory system. They function to transport oxygen into the blood and remove carbon dioxide from it. Now, they have a few important components that you should know about. I mentioned one of those components already. Those are alveoli. The other two components that you should know are called bronchi and bronchioles. So in terms of bronchi and bronchioles, let's go back a little bit to the trachea. So the trachea, again, is that pipe that runs down, from the larynx down into the lungs. And this tube actually begins to branch quite a bit as it travels all the way down into the lungs. And so as the trachea branches, it branches into these smaller branches that are called bronchi. And then these bronchi branch into even smaller tubes or smaller branches that are called bronchioles. Now, what distinguishes bronchioles from bronchi, scientifically speaking? Like if I were to just set a tube from the lungs in front of you and say, hey, is this tube part of the trachea? Is it a bronchi? Is it a bronchiole? What is it? How would you tell? Well, this is just for your interest really only, but apparently the difference between them is in cartilage. Let me share a quote that comes from somebody who has taught anatomy for a bunch of years. Here you go. Bronchi have cartilaginous support in the connective tissue that helps keep them open, even if the smooth muscle contracts in response to an irritant. Bronchioles, by contrast, are smaller with no cartilaginous support, i.e., they have no cartilage, and are at the end of the respiratory conducting system, the tubes that lead directly into alveoli, the gas exchange epithelium. If the smooth muscle contracts, these tubules can close almost completely, making it very difficult for air to reach the alveoli. So the difference between bronchi and bronchioles is that bronchioles don't have cartilage and bronchi do have cartilage. And I'm sure that's not the only difference between these, but I guess that's kind of the distinguishing feature, at least according to this anatomy teacher. Anyways, kind of interesting. Okay, so that's the bronchioles and the bronchi. Again, they're basically branches of the trachea that get smaller and smaller until they reach the ends of the branches called alveoli. And alveoli is the next thing I want to talk about here. So alveoli are the functional unit of the lungs. This is where gas exchange occurs. And as I kind of alluded to a second ago, they're basically the ends of the bronchioles. If bronchioles were streets, these alveoli would be cul-de-sacs. And that's honestly kind of how I think about it, right? You have these branches, these big branches, which are bronchi, and then they branch into bronchioles, which then end in these alveoli, which again, it looks a little bit like, a cul-de-sac. Now, structurally speaking, people usually say these look like a cluster of grapes, and that's pretty true. It's like this ballooning looking structure that has all these little balloons, like a cluster of grapes. Now, in terms of their microanatomy, I'll get a little bit more into this when I talk about physiology, but they're made up of a very thin layer of epithelial tissue, a little bit of extracellular matrix, and then some capillaries. And the really thin nature of these alveoli is what allows gas to diffuse across them. And that's really important since their whole job is to allow for gas exchange. Again, more on that in a little bit. All right, so that is the anatomy of the respiratory system. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of summarize that by giving you the path that gas would see as it comes in from the atmosphere into your lungs. So the first thing that it would do is it would enter your mouth. It would go through the back of your throat, down through the larynx, into the trachea, then into the bronchi, then into the bronchioles, and then it would get to the end of the respiratory tract, the alveoli, where gas exchange occurs. And then, of course, as you breathe out, the gas is going to see the opposite of those as it kind of flows back up the respiratory tract and out of the mouth. Let's talk next about the functions of the respiratory system. But first, a message from our sponsor.
At Med School Coach, we know that studying for the MCAT exam can be challenging. especially for busy students on the go. That's why our team created MCAT Prep, the only all-encompassing study app built specifically for the MCAT. MCAT Prep by Med School Coach provides student access to extremely high-quality content and a personalized curriculum for free. The app has more than 250 videos, 1,000 flashcards, and 1,000 unique MCAT questions. Plus, MCAT Prep by Med School Coach allows students to create a personalized study schedule and track progress over time. You need every competitive advantage you can get to get into medical school, and now you can put the experts from Med School Coach into your pocket. It's the closest pre-med students can come to a personal tutor without spending a penny. Download MCAT Prep by Med School Coach for free at medschoolcoach.com/MCAT. Or download it directly from the Apple Store or Google Play Store. You can achieve your medical school dreams, and MCAT Prep by Med School Coach can help.
Okay, so the respiratory system really has kind of 5 main functions. The first and the most important function is gas exchange. It oxygenates our blood and removes carbon dioxide from our blood, both very important to our functioning. Number 2, it helps in thermoregulation, i.e., it helps control our body temperature. Basically, it helps us cool down when our body temperature is too high. This is especially the case for animals that can't sweat, like dogs, for example. And I'll talk a little bit about panting and how that plays a role in thermoregulation. The third thing it does is it helps us balance our pH. It helps in acid-base regulation. I'll talk more about that. It helps us produce sound. As I said, the larynx plays a role in speech production. I'm not going to talk really too much about that. Just know that the respiratory system plays a role in producing speech, producing sound. And then finally, the respiratory system plays a role in filtering the air that we breathe in. We're breathing in dust, germs all the time, and not everything that we breathe in makes it all the way down deep into our lungs. A lot of it is filtered. And so I'll talk about a few of the mechanisms there that help filter the air we breathe in. Okay, with all those laid out, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go through each of these functions, except sound production, and talk about the physiology that underlies each. I'll start with the most important function, gas exchange. In order for gas exchange to occur, the first thing that you need to be able to do is pull in air to your lungs and then breathe out. And so I quickly want to talk about how this works and then get into gas exchange. So breathing starts with a muscle called the diaphragm. It's a very thin sheet of muscle that sits right underneath the lungs, and it's kind of dome-shaped. Now, when it contracts, it goes from being dome-shaped to being flat. And what that does is that actually enlarges the chest cavity, or it increases the chest cavity's volume. And then when it relaxes, it goes back to being dome-shaped and the chest cavity shrinks, and thus the volume of the chest cavity decreases. I should also mention that there is a set of muscles that are in between your ribs that also play a role in breathing. These are called the intercostal muscles. Basically, they can expand or contract to further open up the volume of the chest cavity and thus increase the volume of the lungs, increase the volume of the chest cavity. Now, when the chest cavity expands, that's going to expand your lungs, increasing your lung volume. And then so when it contracts and that volume gets smaller, the volume of your lungs is going to decrease. And what this is going to do is this is going to cause a pressure differential to form between the gas inside your lungs and the gas in the atmosphere. Here's how this works. And this is where things get a little bit more physicsy/chemistry. So when your lungs are at rest, at the end of an exhale, the pressure inside your lungs is going to be equal to atmospheric pressure, which is about 760 millimeters of mercury, or about 1 atm. Now, as you inhale, as I said, the volume of your lungs is going to increase. And what this is going to do is this is going to cause a decrease in pressure of the gas inside of your lungs. Now, why is that? Well, Boyle's law tells us that there is an inverse relationship between the pressure of a gas and the volume that that gas is contained within. So if I increase the volume, the pressure of the gas is going to decrease. Now, physiologically speaking, when we breathe in, the pressure inside of our lungs is about 754 millimeters of mercury. That's about 6 millimeters of mercury less than atmospheric pressure. Now, what do we know about pressure and fluid flow? Well, we know that fluid, gas in this instance, is going to flow from high pressure to low pressure. So as your lungs expand, the pressure inside of them decreases and gas is going to flow into them because there is lower pressure in your lungs, right? Gas essentially is going to flow down its pressure gradient towards lower pressure and into your lungs. And thus, you are sucking air into your lungs as you breathe in. Now, when you exhale or breathe out, the opposite of this happens. The volume in your lungs is going to decrease, thus the pressure inside is going to rise, and that is going to force gas out of your lungs because the pressure inside your lungs is greater than atmospheric pressure, and gas is going to flow towards lower pressure, which again is the atmosphere. So that's a little bit about how pressure differentials play a role in the breathing process. Now, there's one more physicsy, chemistry-related topic that I want to talk about when it comes to breathing, and that's the effect that surface tension plays on the alveoli. All right, so I want you to picture in your head the alveoli. So they're these grape-shaped structures that are made out of really thin tissue that are the basic functional unit of the lung, right? They're responsible for gas exchange. Now, these are really teeny structures. And inside of the alveoli, you can imagine them being coated with kind of a wet substance. And for the most part, this substance is made out of water. Now, what we know about water is that it really likes to hydrogen bond, right? It's got a region that has a partial negative charge and a region where it has a partial positive charge. As a result, you get these really strong interactions between water molecules. At an air-water interface, water molecules essentially pull really hard on each other, but aren't going to really pull on the air. And what this creates is surface tension. Now, since water lines the inner surface of the alveoli, surface tension from this water pulls the alveoli inwards. And without some kind of mechanism to counter this force from the surface tension of water, the alveoli would actually collapse. Now, mathematically speaking, there's actually a law that shows this. So this law deals with surface tension and spherical structures. It's called the Laplace law. And it says that the pressure felt by a spherical structure by surface tension from whatever fluid is surrounding it is equal to 2 times the surface tension on that structure divided by the sphere's radius. Now, there's one thing you should get from that relationship, and that's that the smaller a spherical structure is, the more pressure that it's going to feel from surface tension. And remember, alveoli are teeny tiny little things. So they feel a ton of surface tension from the fluid, the water, that coats their inner surface. And again, as I said earlier, if there wasn't something to counteract this surface tension, the alveoli would just collapse and your lung would collapse and you wouldn't be able to breathe. Shout out Jordan Sparks. Now, what exactly is it that counters this surface tension? Well, the answer is that it's pulmonary surfactant that counters the surface tension. Now, what is pulmonary surfactant? Well, first off, let's start with the second part of that term, surfactant. Surfactant stands for surface acting agent. And what surfactant does is it reduces surface tension. Now, pulmonary surfactant is just surfactant that's produced by cells in the pulmonary system. And chemically speaking, it's composed of about 90% lipids and about 10% proteins. Mostly, it's composed of phospholipids. And what this pulmonary surfactant does is it essentially acts to separate individual water molecules apart so that they can't hydrogen bond, and thus they can't pull inwards with as much force as they would if you didn't have this surfactant there. It reduces the surface tension. So pulmonary surfactant is to thank for your lung not just collapsing all the time. Now, I know I said I was done with the physicsy type topics in terms of the respiratory system, but I'm sorry, I'm not quite done yet. There's one last thing I want to talk about here, and this is important though, so make sure you're paying attention. The last thing I want to talk about here is the elasticity and the compliance of tissue that's in the lungs. These are both terms you really need to be familiar with for the MCAT. So first off, compliance describes the lung's ability to stretch and expand, right? Think about your lungs. As you breathe in, they're expanding, and then as you breathe out, they're contracting. And so you have to have tissue in there that has the ability to stretch and expand. For example, if you tried blowing up, maybe some skin, like somehow you took some skin and you blew up your skin, well, skin is not the most compliant tissue of all time. And so, you might pop a little hole in it if you're trying to do that. Further, you'd have to blow really, really hard to get a bunch of air under there. It would take a lot of force to force air, to puff up your skin. So again, compliance has to do with the lung's ability to stretch and expand, or I should say the tissue of the lung to stretch and expand. Now, elasticity is very related to compliance. Obviously, this describes the ability of the lung to stretch and expand as well. So I'm going to use those kind of interchangeably here. One thing that might be a little bit different about elasticity versus compliance is that elasticity does refer to the fact that the lung can kind of spring back to its original shape without, being distorted. So that's something also to keep in mind here. Elasticity is pretty much the same as compliance, but there is a little bit of difference. Doubt the MCAT would test on that. So probably just think about those terms as being interchangeable. But again, elasticity does have to do with the fact that the lung can return to its original shape once it's been stretched. And that's actually what I want to start by talking about right there, is that part of what helps us exhale or breathe out is the fact that our lungs want to return to the shape that they're originally in. So they have this kind of elastic component, almost like a balloon, that they want to return to their original shape, and thus they help force air out of the lungs. Now, as you know, that's not the only thing that forces air out, but that sure helps. Now, what exactly makes your lung compliant or makes your lung elastic? Well, there's actually a protein that is in the tissue itself called elastin. Elastin is a 70 kilodalton protein that actually cross-links with other elastin proteins to form an insoluble polymeric protein. And by the way, when elastin forms these big, polymeric proteins, they're known as an elastomer. And so my understanding is that this elastomer is part of the extracellular matrix that surrounds the individual alveoli. Thus, it makes them able to stretch and kind of return to their original shape, which is a property of that elastin protein. So in short, what makes your lungs so elastic? Well, it's a single protein called elastin. So a healthy lung, again, has this ability to stretch, i.e. be compliant, and also to return to its original shape, i.e. be elastic. However, there are a few disease states that can affect the elasticity or the compliance of a lung. For example, COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, is a disease that's characterized by more compliance within the lung. In other words, the lung gets even more stretchy than it usually is. On the other hand, fibrosis of the lung, which is like scarring of the lung tissue or hardening of the lung tissue, leads to less compliance within the lungs. Therefore, the lungs are less stretchy. Okay, so those are a bunch of topics that are related to how your lungs pull in oxygen as well as how they expel it. Now that you know a little bit about that, let's talk about gas exchange. So in order for our cells to produce energy, they need oxygen, at least for the oxidative phosphorylation pathway, which is a much more energy-intensive pathway or produces a lot more energy than the anaerobic pathway. Also, during metabolism, carbon dioxide, CO2, is produced, and that's something that needs to be excreted because too much of it can actually acidify the blood, which is very bad for us. So altogether then, we need to get oxygen into our blood and delivered to our cells, and carbon dioxide needs to be excreted from the body. And both of these are done by the lungs and through a process called gas exchange. And this occurs at kind of the functional unit of the lung, which is the alveoli. So gas exchange in the alveoli has a lot to do with the microanatomy of the alveoli. So I'm going to quickly kind of go over that. Alveoli consists of an epithelial layer of simple squamous epithelium, which are these very thin, flattened cells. So it's one layer of cells, and then those cells are surrounded by an extracellular matrix that has a little bit of that elastin protein in it, which is then surrounded by capillaries. So basically, these alveoli are made up of a really, really thin layer of cells, a single layer, with a little bit of extracellular matrix around them, and then a big network of capillaries that surround that. And that thin structure of the alveoli allows for gas molecules to freely diffuse from the lungs into the capillaries that are surrounding each individual alveoli. And vice versa, right? Gas can travel from the capillaries into the lungs where then it gets breathed out. And you know here that there is two different gases that kind of have opposite flows when it comes to gas exchange. Oxygen is going into the capillaries and carbon dioxide is going out. Now, what I hope you're asking, or at least thinking to yourself right now, is why is it that oxygen is going to go from the alveoli into the capillaries, whereas carbon dioxide is going to do the opposite? It's going to go from the capillaries back into the alveoli. Like, what's pushing oxygen one way and carbon dioxide the other way? The answer to that is that there is a driving force here that's pushing oxygen into the capillaries and carbon dioxide out of the capillaries that has to do with partial pressures. In short, these gases are going to flow down their partial pressure gradient. They're going to go from areas of high partial pressure to areas of low partial pressure. In the same way that I was talking about gases, going from the atmosphere into your lungs because they want to flow from high pressure to low pressure. Same concept. Only in this case, we're talking about partial pressures. And it's at this point that I want to quickly review what exactly partial pressure is. It's obviously an important concept to know for the MCAT, but also if you're going to understand what I'm going to talk about next, you need to have a good grasp of what a partial pressure is. So partial pressure is the pressure of an individual gas in a mixture. So take, for example, atmospheric pressure, which is 760 millimeters of mercury, or about that. A minority of gas in the atmosphere is actually oxygen. It's somewhere around 20%. Thus, the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere is about 20% of 760 millimeters of mercury. When you do the math, that's about 150 millimeters of mercury. Basically, this is oxygen's contribution to atmospheric pressure. Like if you were just to take all the oxygen from the atmosphere and have a telescope that looks just at those molecules, that is the pressure that those molecules exert in the atmosphere. Take the following analogy. So my girlfriend is a first-year law student, and she just finished her first year. And law school, of course, is 3 years long. And so right now, she is 1/3 or 33% lawyer, or 33% escargot, or 33% esquire. So that 33% or 1/3 is her partial pressure of lawyerhood, or 33% of her personality that is a lawyer. If we were to say then she gets 100 personality points, 33 of those points would be designated lawyer. And so her partial pressure of being a lawyer would be 33. So that's a little bit of an analogy. It's kind of dumb. Hopefully, maybe a few of you, it helps see this a little bit more clearly. But anyways, that is the concept of partial pressures. Now, let's get back to the respiratory system. So as I was saying, partial pressure gradients are the reason that gases flow the way that they do. Further, they like to flow from high partial pressure to low partial pressure. Now, with that said, oxygen has a high partial pressure in the gas that is inside your alveoli, and that pressure is about 105 millimeters of mercury. On the other hand, it has a relatively low partial pressure in the capillaries surrounding the alveoli. The pressure there is somewhere around 40 millimeters of mercury. Now, this difference, 40 and 105, is the driving force that moves oxygen from the alveoli into the capillaries that are surrounding the alveoli. Again, the oxygen is going to want to flow from that partial pressure of 105 to the lower partial pressure of 40 millimeters of mercury that is in the capillaries surrounding the alveoli. On the other hand, carbon dioxide has a partial pressure of about 40 millimeters of mercury in the alveolar gas, that's the gas inside the alveoli, and a partial pressure of about 45 within the capillaries. As a result, it's forced the opposite direction. It's going to move from that 45 millimeters of mercury in the capillaries back into the alveoli, where it is then going to be expelled when you breathe out. Now, the last thing I want to mention here is something that I didn't mention yet, and that's that when oxygen moves, from the alveoli into the capillaries, it doesn't just remain a gas inside your capillaries. Could you imagine having little gas bubbles, in your veins? and in your blood vessels as blood flows around, that would be bad. I don't know what it would do, but you could probably ask a doctor and they'd tell you that's bad. So what really happens is that most of the gas that actually gets into your bloodstream is going to dissolve in your blood. And this is where a law called Henry's Law comes in. Henry's Law tells us that the amount of gas that dissolves in a liquid is proportional to the partial pressure of the gas that is above that liquid. So then you could apply that to this system here and say that the amount of oxygen that dissolves in the blood is proportional to the partial pressure of oxygen that is in the blood. Now you might be wondering, why exactly does this matter for the MCAT? How do we apply this to the respiratory system? Why should I give a shit? And that's a good question. And the answer I would say here is that's a good question. And the answer I would say here is this. So the partial pressure of blood in the pulmonary veins, which are the vessels that come right after the capillaries that, are on the alveoli. Thus, this is blood that has just been fully oxygenated. The partial pressure here is about 100 millimeters of mercury. So that's pretty high. Now, what Henry's Law tells us is that because that partial pressure is high, there's going to be a lot of dissolved oxygen in that blood. And that's good because that dissolved oxygen is then going to become attached to hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is going to become saturated. And that's good because then the oxygen can basically be carried around to the rest of the body and delivered to all of our different tissues. So basically, because the partial pressure of oxygen is high right after the alveolar capillaries, a lot of oxygen gets dissolved in the blood, which then can be used. So that is gas exchange, and that's kind of the main function of the respiratory system. A little bit of a less well-known function is thermoregulation. So the respiratory system plays a role in helping us maintain our body temperature. That's what I want to talk about next. Hey everybody, the Med School Coach content team is conducting a survey about this podcast, potential future materials, and your experience with the MCAT in general, and we'd love your feedback. Survey responses are going to be used to improve our MCAT offerings and make sure that we provide students with the most useful materials possible. The survey should take approximately 20 minutes, and the first 100 survey respondents will receive a $20 Amazon gift card via email within 72 hours of your submission. If you're not one of the first 100 to fill out the survey, you'll still receive a $5 gift card. To take the survey, go to the show notes and follow the link in the show notes. Again, the first 100 people to respond are each going to receive a $20 Amazon gift card. So thermoregulation is the process by which your body maintains an acceptable body temperature. And this is something that's pretty constant. Your body temperature usually ranges from somewhere between 97 degrees Fahrenheit and 99 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, in humans, this is mostly done through respiration and evaporation. Evaporation being kind of the main way that it's done, or does the majority of cooling you down. And what happens here is that you sweat, and then this sweat evaporates off your skin, and that removes a bunch of heat. Now, I want to do a little chemistry aside here because it's super important to understand why evaporation removes so much heat from your body. First off, remember what evaporation is. It's a phase change. It's a liquid going into a gas. Now, this phase change is associated with a heat of evaporation. It's an enthalpy change for the evaporation of a liquid into a gas. And a heat of evaporation is really, really high. In other words, it requires a lot of energy to take a liquid and transition it into a gas. So that means that a lot of heat needs to be absorbed by your sweat in order to make that sweat evaporate. And so what does that do? Well, that kind of draws out a lot of heat from your body as the sweat goes from a liquid to a gas. A similar thing happens when you handle a really volatile liquid. Like, have you ever spilled like a little bit of pure ethanol or isopropanol onto yourself? Isopropanol being the nail polish remover. If you've never done it, I recommend just doing it on purpose just to see this effect. But what you'll notice is that it feels really cold. Now, the liquid itself is probably room temperature. It's probably not very cold. But what happens is that ethanol and isopropanol, they're very volatile, meaning that they evaporate really easily. And so what happens is when you spill it on your skin, it starts to evaporate pretty quickly and very readily. And what that does is it does the same thing as sweat. It's going to kind of draw energy from your body in order to make that phase change happen. And because heat of evaporations are so high or so energetic, that is going to pull a lot of heat from your skin, and it's going to make that liquid feel really cold. And again, it's not the liquid that's cold, it's just the fact that it's drawing energy from you because it's evaporating. So that's pretty cool. That's how that works. Now, the respiratory system plays a much smaller role in thermoregulation than does sweating in humans. In short, what the respiratory system does to help you get rid of heat is it removes warm, moist air from your body, thus cooling you down. So you can imagine as you breathe in, the air that is in your lungs is going to kind of heat up from your body temperature, thus, stealing a little bit of heat from inside you. And then when you breathe it out, you're blowing out that warm air, and then you're going to breathe in again and replace it with cool air. And that is going to cool you down a little bit. Also, I should mention that there are capillary beds in your trachea as well as in your nasal passages. And what those can do is those can actually dilate. And then when you breathe in and breathe out, that's going to pass air across those capillaries. And again, that air can capture a little bit of the heat that is in your blood, that is in those capillaries, and remove a little bit of heat from your body that way. Now, there are animals that can't sweat. So we as humans can sweat. We're pretty lucky. However, dogs, cats, pigs, there's a lot of other animals that can't sweat. And so how do they give off heat? If they're running around, what do they do? Well, we know if you have a dog, I guess, I'm assuming you have a dog. If you have a dog, you know what they do is they pant. After they run around or play out in the sun, they sound like this. And that's actually helping cool the dog down. Now, how exactly is that helping cool the dog down? Well, first of all, it's doing kind of the same thing that it does in humans. The dog is blowing out warm air and then breathing in cooler air, thus removing some heat from their body that way. But also, and this was something I learned, and this is super, super interesting, is what you'll notice about dogs is when they do this, they stick their tongue way out, like as far as it goes when they're panting. And the reason that they do this is because part of why panting removes so much heat from the body of a dog is that it actually increases evaporation of water across the moist surfaces of the lungs, the tongue, and the mouth. Basically, when they're panting, they're increasing the movement of air that goes across their upper respiratory tract, and that increases the evaporation in that part of the respiratory tract. And as we know, evaporation removes a lot of heat, and so that's what helps the dogs cool down. I think that's super, super interesting. I had no idea that part of the reason that dogs pant, again, is to increase respiration across their tongue and mouth and some of the wet parts of their upper respiratory tract. So that's how the respiratory system plays a role in thermoregulation. There are two more functions I want to talk about here, the first being particle filtration and the second being pH control. I'll talk about particle filtration first. So obviously, if we were to breathe, big particles into our lungs, that would be bad. Some of those particles could possibly get deposited in the alveoli and block gas exchange. That's bad. You could be breathing in bacteria, viruses, those types of things. And frankly, a lot of that doesn't get filtered, but some of this comes into play here, especially when I talk about the mucus and cilia system. Those help get some bacteria and viruses out. But my overall point is that if we didn't have some sort of filtration system that was in our lungs, in our respiratory system, a lot of things would get in the lungs that are bad. To put it more eloquently, we'd be fucked. So with that said, there are two ways that the respiratory system filters particles. The first is in nasal hairs, and the second is the mucus cilia system that exists in the lungs, as well as in part of the upper respiratory tract. Nasal hair filtration is exactly what it sounds like. Nasal hairs are hairs that are on the inside of the nose. If you actually go to the mirror right now and kind of look up your nose, you'll probably see these hairs, or You could take your iPhone out, just check out the inside of your nose. You'll see these hairs. And by the way, shame on you if you've shaved these off. I know people who shave the inside of their nose. There's those trimmers that are shaped like the inside of your nose. Shame on you. They serve a physiological function. And that function, according to the LSU School of Medicine, is that these hairs filter large particles. Large particles being particles that have a greater diameter than about 10 to 15 microns. That, by the way, is about 1% of a millimeter. That's still super, super, super small particles. And I kind of like to think about these particles as being like dust or dirt particles. So the takeaway here is that your nasal hairs help trap dust, dirt, bigger particles in your nasal passage before they're pulled down into the lungs. Now, particles that are maybe a little too small to get trapped by your nose hairs, or for whatever reason make it through your nose hairs, maybe you've trimmed off all your nose hairs, most of these particles will settle and get trapped in the mucus that lines the membranes of the walls of the trachea, the bronchi, and the bronchioles. Mucus is kind of sticky, so it traps things. At least that's how I like to think about it. Now, these membranes are also lined with little cilia, and they're kind of finger-like projections that help move debris from deep inside of the lungs out of the lungs. And what they do is these cilia basically pulse in kind of a wave-like motion, and it's been described as a beating motion that moves stuff up and out of the respiratory tract. So these things pulse kind of up towards the upper respiratory tract, and eventually it's going to move debris up and up and up and up until it gets near the top of the respiratory tract, and then you cough up that debris as phlegm. So that's the mucus cilia system, the second part of kind of the filtration system or the protection system of the respiratory system. Now let's get to the final function of the respiratory system, which is that it helps maintain your blood pH. So blood pH has to do with how basic or acidic your blood is. When your blood pH is too high, that means your blood is basic, and this can lead to a condition called alkalosis. On the other hand, when your blood pH is too low, that means your blood is acidic, which can lead to acidosis. And so because it's bad if you have too high of a pH or too low of a pH, your body wants to maintain a pretty constant pH level. And that level is between 7.35 and 7.45. And that's an incredibly tight pH range. If you've ever made a buffer before, you know that you could add like a few drops of hydrochloric acid, even maybe like 0.1 molar, and that's going to change the pH of a buffer pretty quickly. So being able to maintain a pH between 7.35 and 7.45 requires quite a few different mechanisms to control that. And it's pretty simple as to how the respiratory system contributes to controlling pH. Simply put, it removes excess carbon dioxide from the blood. Right? When CO2 dissolves in the blood, most of it ends up becoming carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then can dissociate to produce bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. Thus, when the concentration of CO2 increases in your blood, that is going to increase the hydrogen ion concentration, which is going to lower the pH, making your blood more acidic. And as I already said, that is no bueno. So by allowing you to breathe off excess carbon dioxide, the respiratory system helps maintain your blood pH. Pretty simple. All right, on to the final topic I want to cover here, and that is how the respiratory system is controlled. So the respiratory system is kind of interesting in terms of how it's controlled, right? You involuntarily breathe just all the time, whether you're sleeping, whether you're awake, whether you're walking, whatever you're doing, you're breathing, and you're not trying to breathe. It's just happening. However, there is a voluntary override to the system because when you're swimming, or some people when they're sleeping, if you have sleep apnea, you can hold your breath. So the respiratory system involves involuntary contractions as well as voluntary contractions. And it's sort of unique in that way because there's not a lot of other organs that are under involuntary control that you can voluntarily control. For instance, your heart, you can't just stop it if you want to stop it. Your GI tract, you can't stop those movements of food through your GI tract. As hard as you try, you can't really do that. Now, of course, there are parts of your excretory system, part of your GI tract that you can control, luckily enough, but still you get my point. It's a very interesting way that the respiratory system is controlled. So the breathing centers of the brain are in the upper part of the brainstem. That includes the medulla oblongata and the pons. The medulla oblongata controls muscles that cause breathing, so it controls the diaphragm as well as some of the intercostal muscles. So the medulla oblongata literally controls those muscles that make us inhale and exhale. The pons, on the other hand, controls our rate of breathing. So when we're exercising and we need to take in more air, the pons will speed up our breathing rate. However, when we're sleeping or we're at rest, the pons will then slow down our breathing rate. And remember, the brainstem, which is where the medulla oblongata and the pons are, is involved in a lot of different involuntary functions. It helps control our cardiovascular system, our sensation, alertness, some of these things that we don't voluntarily do. So it makes sense then that the respiratory system is controlled from the brainstem. Now, something that's interesting to point out here is that these respiratory centers contain chemoreceptors. And there's actually some chemoreceptors in the heart that do the same thing, but these chemoreceptors detect pH levels in the blood and then send signals to the respiratory centers of the brain to adjust the ventilation rate to then change acidity by either increasing or decreasing the removal of carbon dioxide from the blood. Remember, carbon dioxide in the blood is linked to higher levels of hydrogen ions or a lower pH in the blood. So that's pretty interesting, and that's how the pH regulation that takes place in the respiratory system is controlled. And of course, the one thing I have yet to mention is voluntary breathing. This is controlled by the cerebral cortex, which, as you probably know, the cerebral cortex controls some of our higher level functioning. So it makes sense then that our voluntary breathing, aka being able to hold your breath, is something that is controlled by the cerebral cortex. Well, that is it for this episode on the respiratory system. I hope you found this podcast helpful. I had a ton of fun putting it together. This was probably at least maybe one of the most fun episodes to put together, just because of all the interesting things I learned along the way. And I hope I passed some of that on to you. And hopefully this was somewhat fun to listen to. Now, as always, if you like what we do, please go leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us in the rankings and helps us reach more students. And of course, I always love to read through some of the reviews. They make me smile, laugh, makes it all worth it.
Each episode of MCAT Basics is brought to you by Med School Coach. To access Med School Coach services, including MCAT tutoring and medical school admissions advising, visit our website at medschoolcoach.com. Good luck as you prepare for the MCAT, and we hope you tune in again next time.